I raised my boy with all the love a father could give. But one morning, he showed up at my door with nothing but a suitcase. No word, no warning. By nightfall, I found myself locked inside a nursing home I'd never even heard of. Alone, confused, forgotten. What he didn't know was that this wasn't the end of my story. There was a photo, a letter, a name, and those simple things would change everything our family ever thought it knew. I've always believed that the quietest moments hold the loudest truths. That morning in Yorkshire, the sky had that soft, misty, gray-eyed, grown to love in my old age. It wasn't raining, not really, just that gentle drizzle, the British call a bit damp. The air smelled like wet stone and moss, and the sparrows chirped from the hedges as if nothing in the world could ever go wrong. I was in my armchair by the bay window, my spot, with a knitted blanket over my knees and a lukewarm cup of tea in my hand. Not too hot, not too strong. Just the way Martha used to make it before she passed away. God, how I missed her. 43 years together. I still talk to her sometimes, mostly when no one was around. Not that anyone ever really was. The radio was playing softly in the background, an old jazz station out of Leeds. I liked that it still played the classics. Real music, not the noise the kids listen to these days. On the wall opposite me, our wedding photo hung slightly crooked. I'd been meaning to fix it for weeks. There we were, young, smiling, eyes full of hope. Martha in her lace dress, me in my RAF uniform, trying not to look terrified. The house was silent, aside from the hum of the old radiator. It was the kind of silence I'd grown used to. The kind you don't notice until it's broken. And that morning, it was at exactly 9:03 a.m. The front door creaked open. No knock, no bell, just the sound of someone using their own key. Edward, my son, he always did that. Treated my home like a hotel lobby. I heard his boots thudding down the hallway, heavy and impatient. I knew that rhythm, the walk of a man who'd made up his mind about something. Dad, he called. In here, I answered, keeping my voice calm. He appeared in the doorway with a forced smile, holding his phone in one hand and a coffee cup in the other. Morning, he said, stepping in like he hadn't just walked into a stranger's house. Morning, son, I said. You're early. He looked around the room as if expecting it to look worse than it did. That irritated me. I wasn't living in filth. My house was clean, dusty, sure, but clean. I still managed to take care of myself. I cooked my meals, washed my clothes. I wasn't helpless. I thought I'd swing by and check on you, Edward said, shifting uncomfortably. See how things are. Things are fine, I said. Same as always. He didn't sit down. That was my first clue. He just stood there, like he had a plane to catch. Look, Dad, he started, and that's when I felt it. That tightening in the gut. That sense that something was about to change, and not in a good way. He cleared his throat. We've been talking, me and Sarah, and we think it's time you had a bit more support. I narrowed my eyes. Support? You're 81, Dad. It's a lot. Living alone. The stairs. The cooking. I'm managing just fine. I cut in. He looked away, avoiding my eyes. Yeah, but it's not just about managing. It's about being safe. Being cared for. Ah, there it was. The speech. The carefully rehearsed concern. The false empathy. I'd seen it coming for months. Little comments during family dinners. Awkward pauses when I mentioned doing things. Myself, I just didn't think it would happen like this. Not without a warning. Not on a quiet morning in Yorkshire. You mean a home? I said flatly. Edward nodded slowly. Greenhaven. It's not far from here. We've already spoken to the staff. They've got a room available this afternoon. Actually, my heart dropped. This afternoon. I looked at the clock. It was barely 9:30. You've already arranged this. He didn't answer. Just looked at the floor, ashamed. That's when I realized something else. He wasn't just visiting. He was here to take me. Like I was a child who needed supervision. Like I was some old coat being donated to a charity shop. I haven't agreed to anything, I said quietly. "We just want what's best for you," he replied. But he didn't look at me when he said it. I looked around the room. The shelves of old books I'd read to Martha on stormy nights, the cuckoo clock she bought in Austria, the cushion with her perfume still faintly clinging to it, all of it about to be left behind. "Edward," I said, my voice suddenly shaking. "This is my home." "I know," he replied. "But it's time." No tears came. Not yet. Just that deep, aching numbness. I stared out the window as the drizzle turned into steady rain. Across the street, Mrs. Holloway was planting flowers in her garden, completely unaware that my world had just shattered. "You could have told me," I said. "I didn't want you to worry." "Worry?" I laughed bitterly. "Son, you took everything from me in one morning. You didn't even give me the dignity of a conversation." "I'm sorry," he said, his voice barely audible. "But sorry doesn't undo betrayal. Sorry doesn't erase the humiliation of being relocated. Like furniture." I didn't say another word as he started gathering a few things into a suitcase, like a hotel porter. I watched him from the chair, frozen, as he packed away my life in neat little stacks. My sweater, my razor, my reading glasses, all heading somewhere I hadn't chosen, somewhere I hadn't even seen. Greenhaven. The name alone made me sick. Outside, the clouds thickened. The jazz station faded into static. My tea had gone cold. And just like that, the quiet peace of my Yorkshire morning of my life was gone. I always thought I'd die in this house, surrounded by the things I loved, with a book on my lap and the memory of Martha in the air. Instead, I was being pushed out like an old painting no longer fit for the wall. The rain hadn't stopped by the time Edward finished packing. It tapped steadily against the car roof like a slow, cruel drumbeat. He opened the boot of his silver SUV and placed my suitcase inside like it was just another errand to cross off. A list. No words. No emotion. Just ... procedure. I stood on the front steps of my home, with my cane in one hand and my coat zipped to the neck. I looked back at the door, still ajar, as if the house itself was waiting for me to come. Back inside. The kitchen light was still on. The kettle was still warm. But I wasn't going back in. I took one final look. The brickwork Martha and I had laid with our own hands. The rose bush she planted after the twins were born. The chipped paint on the windowsill I kept meaning to fix. Everything I'd built over a lifetime, left behind in the space of an hour. Edward didn't say much on the drive. Maybe he thought silence would make it easier. It didn't. It made it worse. The only sound was the occasional squeak of the wipers dragging across the glass and the muffled voice of a sat-nav guiding us toward Greenhaven. The name alone felt like a euphemism. Nothing about it sounded green or safe, just final. I sat in the passenger seat, staring out at the gray hills of the North Yorkshire countryside. The same hills I used to hike when I was younger. The same ones Martha and I used to visit every spring, with a flask of tea and cheese sandwiches wrapped in wax paper. Now they passed by like ghosts. Edward cleared his throat once or twice, as if about to speak, but didn't. What would he say, anyway? "Sorry for dismantling your life. Hope you like being warehoused with strangers." Instead, I spoke. "You remember when you broke your arm on the school field?" I said. He glanced at me, confused. "You were 12. You slipped in the mud during a rugby match. It was pouring rain, just like today." "Yeah, I remember," he muttered. "I carried you all the way to the car. You were half conscious. Mom was in tears. We got you to the hospital, and I sat with you for 12 hours until they put the cast on. You kept squeezing my hand." He stayed quiet. "I never left you behind, Edward. Not once." "I know, Dad," he whispered. "But now, you're leaving me, not even giving me the chance to fight it." He sighed, frustrated. "You're not being left behind. You're being looked after." I turned to him then, slowly. "Don't dress it up. You've made a choice. And it wasn't mine." That shut him up for a while. We passed through a little village Ripley, with its old stone cottages and crooked chimney stacks, people walking their dogs, a couple pushing a pram, life going on. It was surreal to know that while my world was being appended, everyone else's kept turning. I remembered the first time Edward brought Sarah to meet us. He was nervous, tripping over his words. Martha made tea, of course. She always believed tea could solve anything. Sarah was lovely, kind, respectful. Back then, I had no idea that years later, she'd be part of the decision to ship me off like unwanted furniture. Around the time we reached the A61, the road widened and the traffic thinned. We were getting close. I could feel it in my bones, that cold premonition that creeps into your chest and doesn't let go. I looked down at my hands resting in my lap, wrinkled, veined, still strong, though not what they once were. These hands had built a home, held a child, buried a wife. Now, they trembled with anger and grief. Do the kids know? I asked, staring ahead. Edward hesitated. Not yet. We thought we'd tell them once you were settled. Of course, heaven forbid they feel uncomfortable. Heaven forbid they ask why Granddad wasn't at Sunday lunch anymore. I wanted to scream. Instead, I asked, what did you do with the letters on my desk? What letters? The ones from your mom, the ones I kept all these years. He glanced at me, uneasy. I think I left them in the drawer. I wasn't sure what was important. I bit the inside of my cheek. What was important? He didn't know. He didn't even ask. Soon, we turned off onto a smaller road, Daleview Lane, and I saw the sign, Greenhaven Residential and Care Facility for the Elderly. A row of hedges lined the property, manicured within an inch of their lives. The building itself was modern, all glass and artificial warmth. It looked more like a bank than a place to spend the last years of your life. No ivy on the walls. No creaking gate. No soul. Edward parked near the entrance and cut the engine. We sat in silence. Then, softly, he said, "It's not forever, Dad. Just until we can figure out something better." I turned to him. "Don't lie to yourself, son. This is forever. You don't bring someone here with a suitcase for a temporary stay." He looked away. The rain was lighter now, just a drizzle. A nurse stood by the door under a small awning, clipboard in hand. She smiled politely when she saw us. My death sentence, smiling at me, in uniform. Edward got out and retrieved my bag. I stayed seated, my heart thudding. My body felt heavy, like I was being buried alive. Finally, I opened the door and stepped out. The wind hit me first, cold and sharp, like a slap. Then the nurse approached. "Mr. Whitaker," she asked kindly, "welcome to Greenhaven." I nodded once, too tired to speak. Edward walked beside me up the path. Then, suddenly, he stopped. "I'll call you later tonight," he said. I didn't answer. "I'm sorry, Dad. Truly." I met his eyes. "No, you're not. You're just relieved." He said nothing more, just gave me a weak nod, turned, and walked away. And just like that, I was alone. A man with a cane, a suitcase, and 1,000 memories. Standing at the door of a building I never asked to enter. I thought I'd lived through enough endings in life. But this one was the quietest. And somehow, the cruelest. The automatic doors of Greenhaven slid open with a soft whoosh. But to me, they felt like the gates of a prison. Behind them, the air was unnaturally warm, sterile, and still, with a faint smell of disinfectant, cooked carrots, and something else I couldn't quite name. Something old, something forgotten. Nurse Helen I remembered her name from the clipboard wall beside me, with forced cheer in her voice. "You'll like it here, Mr. Whitaker. We've got scheduled activities, 3 meals a day, laundry service, even a little garden out back where residents can sit and chat." She kept talking, but I wasn't listening. My eyes were scanning everything, the beige floors, the generic paintings of trees, the identical doors with gold-plated numbers. There was no history here, no personality, just a long hallway with fluorescent lights that hummed like a mosquito in your ear. Room to be. That was mine now. She opened the door and stepped aside like she was revealing something grand. "There we go. All yours." It was a modest room. 1 single bed, a dresser, a plastic armchair by the window, and a tiny in-suite bathroom. On the nightstand, there was a laminated welcome note, Greenhaven, where every day is a new beginning, new beginning. No, this wasn't a beginning, it was a slow ending in disguise. I'll give you a moment to settle in, Helen said. Lunch is at noon in the dining hall, room 5. See if you'd like to meet your orientation buddy, Mr. Blackstone. She smiled and left. The door closed with a soft click that sounded far too final. I stood there for a moment, staring at the suitcase Edward had left by the bed. It was a black Samsonite, scuffed and dusty, filled with what he thought I needed. A few jumpers, my shaving kit, my slippers, and 2 of my books. 2 out of the hundreds I owned. I sat slowly on the edge of the bed, and for the first time in years, I felt small. This wasn't a visit. This wasn't a break. I knew that now, with every breath I took. This was exile. I unpacked in silence. Each item I pulled from the suitcase felt more alien than the last. A sweater Martha had knitted for me 30 years ago. A framed photo of us at the seaside in Whitby, back when the kids were little. The smile on her face in that photo, carefree wind in her hair, hit me like a punch to the chest. I placed it on the dresser, next to the lamp. Then I sat by the window. The view, a concrete wall, and a narrow strip of grass, with 3 benches facing the parking lot. One of the benches was occupied by an elderly woman with a walker. She didn't move, just sat there, staring into nothing. I watched her for 20 minutes. She didn't blink once. At lunch, I shuffled into the dining hall, cane in hand, trying not to look as out of place as I felt. The room was painted the same shade of pastel green as the walls in my old primary school. Plastic chairs, vinyl tablecloths, the kind of institutional design meant to be calming but ended up feeling like a hospital waiting room. There were maybe 20 residents seated already. Most were silent. A few were being spoon-fed. One man near the window was muttering to himself, looping the same phrase over and over. They forgot, they forgot, they forgot. A nurse placed a tray in front of me: chicken stew, mashed potatoes, peas. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't food either. It was fuel. Then I saw him, Mr. Blackstone, room 5C. He was seated at the far end of the table, upright, dressed in a dark navy cardigan with brass buttons, his hair slicked back neatly, despite his age. He must have been well into his 80s, maybe older, a proud posture, eyes sharp, scanning the room like a general, surveying a battlefield. I nodded to him. He didn't respond. Later, I was told he was a veteran, like me. But he hadn't spoken in years, not since his wife passed. They said he used to read the paper every morning and correct it with a red pen. Now he just sat. We were all sitting. That was the main activity here. Waiting for meals, waiting for medication, waiting for visits that may never come. Waiting for the end. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the sounds of the building, the slow shuffle of slippers down the hallway. A television left on too loud in the next room, someone coughing endlessly 2 doors down. Then a scream, short, sharp, female. A nurse rushed past my door moments later. No one explained anything. I didn't sleep much. The mattress was thin, the pillow flatter than a newspaper, but it wasn't the physical discomfort that kept me awake. It was the sheer unreality of it all. How quickly a life could be dismantled and repackaged into a sterile, beige room. How the past could be erased in under 24 hours. In the early hours of the morning, around 3 a.m., I got up and sat by the window again. The elderly woman from before was gone. The parking lot was empty. The rain had stopped. And for a moment, I wept. Not loudly, just quietly. As quietly as everything else in this place. I wasn't crying because I was lonely. I'd been lonely before. I was crying because I'd been forgotten. Not by the world, by the people who were supposed to remember me. They told me Greenhaven was a place for safety, a place for care. But the walls here don't care. They only hold stories that no one bothers to ask about anymore. It was on the 3rd night, at Greenhaven, that I found the photo. I hadn't planned to go rummaging through drawers. Frankly, I didn't want to touch anything in that room more than I had to. It felt like every surface was covered in quiet resignation. But that evening, while trying to find a decent pair of socks in the bottom drawer of the dresser, my fingers brushed against something thin, cold, and smooth. It wasn't mine. I knew every item Edward had packed. This wasn't from my suitcase. I pulled it out. A photograph. Old, faded, bent at the corners. Slightly curled with time. It was black and white, clearly from another era. Maybe the late 50s or early 60s. It showed to people a young woman standing in a field of tall grass, smiling, laughing, and beside her, a little boy, maybe 5 years old, looking up at her with an expression that was oddly familiar. He had thick dark hair, a round face, and eyes that carried a strange kind of knowing. My breath caught in my throat, because the woman, despite the grainy photo, despite the decades that had surely passed, looked exactly like Martha. Not just a resemblance. It was her. I knew that smile. I'd seen it when she held our children. I'd seen it when she danced, barefoot, in the kitchen. I'd seen it when we stood together in front of the sea in Brighton, just after she said yes to marrying me. But this photo wasn't from our life together. This child wasn't Edward. It wasn't anyone I knew. And the most chilling detail, on the back of the photograph, written in faint, cursive handwriting, undoubtedly Martha's, were the words, "My heart, always, M." No date, no explanation, just that single line. I sat down heavily on the bed, the photo trembling in my hands. Martha never told me about a child before Edward. She never hinted at anything like this. Was it possible? Did she have a son before we met? Did she give him up? I stared at the child's face again. There was something hauntingly familiar in the way his eyes squinted slightly when he smiled, a tilt of the head I'd seen before. Somewhere. But where? I placed the photo gently on the nightstand and stared at it for what felt like hours. The room was silent, except for the occasional tick of the wall clock and the faint murmur of a television in someone else's room down the hall. Yet my mind was racing. Why had the photo been here? Was it left behind by someone? Had it been deliberately placed in this drawer? Or worse, had someone known I'd end up in this room? I stood, walked to the door, and peeked out into the hallway. Empty. It was nearly midnight. The lights were dimmed. Most of the residents were asleep, or at least confined to their rooms. The nurse's station, at the far end of the corridor, was lit but unmanned. I closed the door and sat again. Martha and I had always been honest with one another, at least. I believed we had. She'd told me about her childhood, about growing up in Birmingham, about her time working as a schoolteacher in Manchester before she met me. She'd told me about her parents, about losing her mother to pneumonia and her father to grief not long after. But never once had she mentioned a child, a previous relationship. Yes, there had been one. A man named Thomas, I think. She'd spoken of him briefly, always in a hushed tone, with the air of something long buried. She never spoke badly of him, only vaguely. It wasn't meant to be, she'd said once, then changed the subject. Could Thomas have been the father? Was this child the reason she never wanted to return to Manchester? Suddenly, a knock at the door jolted me from my thoughts. 3 short taps. Not the nurse's knock. It was gentler. I opened it to find Mr. Blackstone, standing in the hallway in his slippers, still wearing that same navy cardigan, eyes sharp even at this hour. He didn't speak. He never did. But in his hand was a small wooden box. He held it out to me with surprising firmness, his knuckles pale and trembling. I took it, confused. "What's this?" I asked. He gave me a long, unreadable look. Then he nodded toward the photo sitting on my nightstand, and he left. Just turned and walked back to his room without a word. I stood there, frozen, back inside. I sat with the box in my lap for a few minutes before finally opening it. Inside, a letter, yellowed with age, still sealed, and beneath the letter, a train ticket from 1962, Manchester to Birmingham. I opened the letter with shaking hands. "Dear Martha, I waited for you at the station that day. You never came. I know you were scared. I was too. But I've never stopped thinking about you. Or about him. I kept the ticket all this time. I kept the memory of that summer buried because I thought it was the kindest thing. You had your life. You had someone else. But now, I think maybe we deserve to remember, too. He asks about you sometimes. I never had the answers he deserved. Maybe one day, he'll find them himself. T.I. sat in silence, reading it over, and O.V.E.R.T. Thomas. The man from before me. The man Martha never truly spoke about. The father of the child in the photo. But the part that unsettled me most wasn't the confession. It wasn't even the truth about Martha's hidden past. It was the sentence. Maybe one day, he'll find them himself. Was that day now? Was I about to find something that had been hidden for decades? And if so, why here? Why now? Why Greenhaven? They say old age brings peace. But I was starting to feel that the older we get, the more ghosts we carry, some of them not even our own. The next morning, I didn't go to breakfast. I couldn't. The photo, the letter, the train ticket. My mind had become a storm of questions, with no safe harbor in sight. I kept replaying it in my head. The handwriting, the initials, the sorrow in those short lines. Thomas, that name again. And Mr. Blackstone. Why had he given me that box? How did he have it? Why now? The old veteran hadn't said a single word to me since I arrived until last night, and even then, he'd spoken without speaking, with only a look and a box that changed everything. Eventually, curiosity pushed me out of my room. I shuffled down the hallway, cane in hand, to room 5C, his room. I knocked, softly at first. No answer. Then a bit louder. Still nothing. The door was slightly ajar. I hesitated, then pushed it open. His room was dim, lit only by the morning sun through half-closed blinds. It was clean, orderly. On the small table near the window, there was a neatly folded orange cap, the same I used to wear. I stared at it for a moment, a silent acknowledgement between two men who'd worn the same uniform in different decades. Then I saw him, Mr. Blackstone, sitting in the chair beside the window, back straight, hands resting on his knees, eyes open and alert. "Good morning," I said quietly. He didn't reply, but he didn't turn me away either. So I stepped in. I found the letter. I continued. And the photo. That woman in the picture. Her name was Martha. She was my wife. Still no response. I swallowed hard. She never told me about any of this. Never mentioned a child before our marriage. Never spoke about Thomas. At that name, his eyelids fluttered, and something in his posture shifted, barely. But I saw it. I took another step forward. "You knew her, didn't you?" Silence. "So, I tried a different approach. You gave me that box for a reason. I want to understand. I need to." And then finally, he spoke, a voice like gravel and rain, slow and deliberate. "You're the one she married." My heart nearly stopped. His eyes were still locked on the window, but his words pierced through me like cold steel. "You're Thomas," I whispered. He gave a slow nod. Not of pride, not of acknowledgement, but of acceptance, as though carrying that name had become too heavy to lift. "You were in Manchester, in the 60s, I said. "You and Martha, we were young," he interrupted, still staring out. "I was foolish. She was fire, bright, honest. She never wanted to give him up." "Him," I echoed, though I already knew. "Our son," he said, "born in the spring of '61, named him Henry, after my father." I gripped the edge of the chair across from him and slowly sat down. Thomas continued. "Her parents, strict, devout, they threatened to cut her off. Said she'd shame the family. We had no money, no jobs, no future. I was working factory shifts by day, studying at night. We planned to run." He closed his eyes for a moment. "She never showed up at the station." My mind flashed back to the train ticket, preserved for over 60 years. She told me later, after she married youth, her father forced her to give the baby to a church-run orphanage. She said it broke her. She never forgave herself. I felt the weight of those words settle over me like wet cement. I'd known Martha for over 4 decades. I knew the curve of her laughter. the rhythm of her walk, the way she liked her tea with half a sugar cube. But I never knew this part of her. She'd buried it deep, so deep I wonder if she'd even allowed herself to mourn it properly. What happened to him? I asked. To Henry. Thomas gave a slow, bitter smile. That's the part I could never answer. The orphanage burned down in '63, records lost, children scattered across the country, some adopted, some didn't make it. A long pause. I spent years searching, then I stopped. Life moved on. I married, lost her, drafted into the service, fought in the Falklands, retired. Then came here. I looked at him, truly looked at him, now not as a stranger, not as a silent veteran, but as Martha's first heartbreak, as the man who might have become my son's father if fate had chosen a different path. She never said a word. I whispered again, mostly to myself. She loved you, he said softly, finally meeting my gaze. I didn't need her to say it. I saw it in the way she spoke about Yorkshire, about your children. You gave her peace. Something I never could. We sat in silence for a while after that. Two old men, bound not by rivalry, but by a woman we both loved, and a child neither of us got to hold. Eventually, I pulled the photograph from my pocket and placed it on the table between us. I think she left this behind for a reason, I said. Maybe she hoped it would eventually find its way back to someone. Thomas nodded slowly. Some things refuse to stay buried. He reached out a trembling finger and traced the edges of her face in the photo. She always wore her hair like that. When she was nervous, he murmured. I let him have that moment. After a few minutes, I stood to leave. As I reached the door, Thomas spoke again. I think he's alive. I turned. I feel it in my bones. He said, I've felt it for years, like something unfinished, like a breath still waiting to be exhaled. That night, I couldn't sleep again. Not because of the walls or the coughs or the faint whir of the hallway fan, but because something had shifted inside me. A door had opened. One I didn't even know was locked, and behind it wasn't just grief or regret. There was hope and the possibility that the story of our family wasn't over yet. Sometimes, we bury truth to protect the ones we love. But love has a way of digging it up again, especially when it's been waiting in silence for over half a century. There are moments in life when everything you believe to be solid begins to shift. Not violently, not loudly, but like slow tectonic plates underneath your feet. You're still standing, but the ground is no longer the same. That was how I felt the morning after speaking to Thomas. I didn't go looking for answers that day. They came to me. It was after lunch, a tasteless casserole and overboiled carrots, when Nurse Louise approached me in the common room. She was young, late 20s maybe, kind eyes behind round glasses. One of the few staff here who didn't speak to us like we were preschoolers. She knelt beside my chair, holding something in her hand. Mr. Whitaker, she said softly, this came in today's mail. No return address, but it's addressed to you. I furrowed my brow. Mail. I hadn't received mail in months. Ever since Edward took over my post, I rarely got anything anymore, not even the local paper. She handed me the envelope. It was pale yellow, the kind of stationery you only see in old desk drawers or museums now. The name written on the front, George Whitaker, was in careful cursive, not Martha's, but almost as elegant. And the handwriting, it felt familiar. I looked up at Nurse Louise. Did anyone see who delivered it? She shook her head. No. Just arrived with the facilities post this morning. Maybe someone dropped it off. I nodded slowly. Thank you, love. She gave me a warm smile and walked away. I held the envelope in my lap for several minutes before opening it. Something about it felt sacred, like I was holding a piece of the past that had never wanted to be seen. I slid a finger under the flap and pulled out a folded page, a single sheet, no date, no signature. But as soon as I read the first sentence, I knew, to the man who held her heart after I lost it, ... My throat tightened. It was from Thomas. But this wasn't written recently. The ink had faded in places. The folds were soft, as if the letter had been opened and closed many times. A relic of regret. I continued reading. I've written this letter 100 times in my head, but only once on paper. I never meant for you to see it. Maybe that's why it never left my drawer. But if it has found you now, it must be because the truth is ready to be known. I loved Martha before you. That kind of first love that burns love. The kind that comes with no instruction manual and leaves no survivors. We were young, foolish, brave in the wrong ways, and cowardly in the right ones. When she told me she was pregnant, I thought I'd die from the weight of it. But she didn't flinch. She wanted to keep him, raise him, fight for him. It was the world that stood in the way. I could almost hear Thomas's voice in those words. Not the quiet, broken man I'd met in room 5C, but the young one. Before war and death and loneliness had worn him down, we named him Henry. He had her eyes, her stubborn mouth, my hands. We had 3 months together, 3 months of stolen minutes and whispered dreams. Then they took him. And she changed. Not in a bad way. Just ... quietly. She smiled less. She looked out the window more. And then one day, she said she was leaving Manchester. Said she was starting a new life. I never hated you, George. I envied you, yes, but never hated. You gave her what I couldn't. Safety, peace, a proper home. I watched from afar. I even saw you once, in the market in Leeds, years ago. She was holding your hand. She looked happy. I turned away before she saw me. I paused there. A chill ran through me. What would I have done if I had known? If I'd seen him watching us back then, would it have changed anything? Would I have walked away? No. I loved Martha, deeply, fiercely, and I know she loved me. But love does not erase the past. It only buries it. And now, the past was climbing back out of its grave. I never found Henry. I tried. I visited orphanages, wrote letters, begged strangers for names. But his trail ended with a fire in '63. I told myself that maybe it was for the best, that some doors should stay closed. But lately, I've started to believe otherwise. I feel him near, somehow. As if the world has begun to tilt us all back toward him. Maybe that's why I kept this letter. Maybe I knew it would find you instead of him. I reached the end of the page. No signature, just space. But it didn't feel unfinished. It felt like a passing of the torch. Thomas had tried to find Henry. Now it was my turn. And more than that, something in his words gave me a quiet, growing suspicion. I feel him near. What if Henry wasn't out there in some distant corner of the country? What if he was closer than any of us had dared imagine? I folded the letter carefully and placed it in the drawer with the photo. Then I picked up the photo again, staring at the child's face, round cheeks, slightly wide nose, dark hair, eyes like mine, not like Thomas's, not like Martha's, mine. And that's when it hit me. What if Edward wasn't my only son? What if Henry had never been adopted? What if he'd grown up in the system, bounced from place to place, and eventually ended up right here, in Yorkshire? What if I had spoken to him already, met him without knowing? I thought of the residents here, the faces, the expressions. One face in particular stood out. Someone who worked here, not as a resident, but as a maintenance worker. A man in his early 60s. Quiet, gentle, always nodded when we crossed paths. Hadn't paid him much attention until now. His name was Harold, short for Henry. I didn't know, not yet, but the seed was planted, and it was growing fast. Some letters are never meant to be sent, but the truth they carry doesn't disappear. It waits sometimes for decades, until the right hands are ready to receive it. It started with her laugh, not the loud kind. No, Louise never laughed loudly, but there was a softness in it, like a memory trapped in sunlight. That kind of laugh that comes from deep inside the bones, familiar in a way that makes you turn your head without knowing why. And one afternoon, sitting near the greenhouse behind Greenhaven, I heard that laugh float across the garden, and something in my chest froze, because it was Martha's laugh. Not similar, not close, it was the same. I turned. Nurse Louise was kneeling beside one of the residents, sweet old Barbara, who loved her rose bushes more than she liked most people. Louise had just made a comment, And Barbara, surprisingly, chuckled. Then Louise laughed too, and I stared, because in that moment, for a split second, the way the light hit her face, the angle of her chin, the way her hair slipped loose behind her ears, it was like seeing Martha again, not as I knew her last, fragile, fading, but as she was in the 60s. When we met at the train station in Leeds, vibrant, alive, unmistakable. I must have stared too long, because Louise caught my gaze and gave a small wave. Everything, all right, Mr. Whitaker, she called. I nodded. Yes, just lost in thought. She smiled, then turned back to Barbara. But I didn't look away. I couldn't. Later that day, back in my room, I sat staring at the old photograph. Again, the one I'd found in the drawer. The woman in it, unmistakably Martha, holding a child. And behind them, a small building with ivy climbing up the walls. A school, an orphanage. I brought the photo closer. There was a detail I hadn't noticed before. A tiny handwritten date on the back. July 1962. That was a year before Edward was born. Martha never mentioned a trip that summer. She told me she'd visited her sister in Brighton. But something had never quite added up. She'd come back quieter, more distracted, and now everything was beginning to line up too perfectly. A child given up in 1962. A letter from Thomas describing that child, Henry, and now a young woman here, working in this very home, with Martha's face, Martha's laugh. Was it possible? Could Louise be? The next morning, I waited until she was alone in the break room. I pretended to be looking for my walking stick, an old trick that usually got me a few minutes of conversation without raising eyebrows. Louise smiled as I stepped in. Looking for your trusty staff again, she teased. I chuckled. Seems to have a life of its own. She bent down near the table. Let's see if it rolled under here. I hesitated. Then I said softly, may I ask you something personal? She looked up, surprised, but not uncomfortable. Of course. I held out the photograph. This was my wife, I said. Her name was Martha. This picture was taken long before I met her. Louise took the photo gently, studying it. Her eyes widened. She looks exactly like my mom, she whispered. I felt my heart begin to pound. Your mother, she nodded. Her name was Sarah. She died when I was 16, but I have pictures. One of them looks almost exactly like this. I swallowed hard. And your grandparents? I only knew one. My Nan. She died when I was a child. Name was Martha too, actually. The silence in the room thickened. My hands were shaking now. Louise, I said carefully. May I ask, was your mother adopted? She blinked. Yes, she never knew her birth parents. It was always a quiet topic. I think it hurt her. She searched for them for a while, but the trail was cold. All she had was a name, Martha L. That's it. I nodded slowly. Martha Louise, her middle name. I sat down before I collapsed. Louise, I whispered, your grandmother Martha was my wife. Her mouth dropped open slightly. But how? I took a deep breath. And for the next 15 minutes, I told her everything. About the photo, the letter, from Thomas, the child named Henry, the missing years, the secret that Martha carried with her to the grave. Louise sat frozen, her eyes glassy with disbelief, her hand gripping the photograph like it might vanish. But that would make, yes, I said. Your mother was my wife's daughter, which means, she stared at me. You're my granddaughter. It was a strange thing, that moment. There should have been fireworks, some dramatic music, perhaps, or tears, but instead, it was silence, a heavy, beautiful silence. Louise reached across the table and took my hand. I've always felt disconnected, she whispered. Like something about me was floating. Now I know why. I squeezed her hand gently. And I said, always felt like something was missing from my family. And now, I've found it. The days that followed were surreal. We had to be sure, of course. Louise asked for a DNA test, and I agreed. It came back positive, a 99.97% match. She was my granddaughter. And all this time, we had passed each other in the halls, exchanged polite hellos, shared quiet smiles, never knowing. When I told Edward, he was speechless. He didn't speak for several minutes. Then he asked for Louise's number. "I'd like to meet her," he said. "Properly." We arranged a small gathering in the Greenhaven garden the following weekend. Just the three of us. No noise, no rush. Edward brought an old photo album, one I hadn't seen in years. Louise brought her mother's only photograph from childhood, a small black and white print that, when placed next to Martha's old photo, left no doubt. Same smile, same eyes, same soul. We sat for hours, talking, crying, laughing. For the first time in years, I felt complete, not because I'd uncovered a secret, but because the silence it left behind had finally been filled by love, by legacy, by family. They sent me here to fade quietly, but instead, I found the future echoing in the past, and a granddaughter who brought both back to life. I used to think Greenhaven would be the last page of my story. When they drove me here without warning, without even asking me what I wanted, I felt like a chapter had ended. Not just ended, been ripped out and thrown away. I was furious, hurt, embarrassed. I remember the first night, lying in that cold, unfamiliar bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering if this was how the great story of my life would close, in silence. But now, as I sit by the garden window, watching Nurse Louise, my granddaughter, serve tea to a table of residents with that quiet grace she inherited from a woman she never knew, I realize I was wrong. Greenhaven was never the final chapter. It was the prologue to a new book entirely. The weekend after our discovery, Edward returned to visit again. But this time, he wasn't checking on me like a chore to cross off. He wasn't rushing to catch a train. He stayed. We talked, really talked, about things we hadn't spoken of in years. Like the day he left for university in Edinburgh. How Martha cried when we waved goodbye. How distant he became after her funeral. How I never told him how proud I was of the man he became. I told him the truth, that I didn't want to be put here. He looked down at his hands and said quietly, "I didn't know what else to do." Dad and I believed him. He wasn't cruel, just overwhelmed, just blind to the quiet dignity of growing old. He reached across the table, gripped my hand. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I thought I was protecting you, but I was protecting myself from feeling guilty. I forgive you," I said, and I meant it. The following week, Louise brought something unexpected. She wheeled in a large cardboard box, labeled in faded pen, "Sarah's Things." Inside were photo albums, school records, letters, pieces of a life lost between generations. We sat together in my room, sorting through the past. She asked me questions about Martha, about how she used to hum when she folded laundry, how she'd sneak sugar into Edward's cereal when I wasn't looking. "I never knew anything about her," Louise said. "Only stories from my mom, and even those were vague. It was like a door no one wanted to open." I smiled. "Now that door is wide open, and you're standing in it." We took a photo that day, the three of us. Me, Edward, and Louise. I insisted on using my old film camera, the same one Martha had given me on our 10th anniversary. The photo came out slightly grainy, but I didn't mind. It looked timeless, like something you'd find in a shoebox 50 years from now, and feel the warmth still clinging to it. We pinned it to the wall of my room, right next to the photograph of Martha holding baby Sarah. 2 photos, 2 generations. 2 women, both lost, and yet, through this place, through this winding path of fate they lived on, news spread slowly in Greenhaven, as it always did. Some of the residents began whispering about Mr. Whitaker's long-lost family. Others congratulated me like I'd won the lottery. Mr. Blackstone, who hadn't spoken a word since I arrived, gave me a thumbs up and muttered, "About bloody time." It became a joke among the nurses. They started calling me the legend of Room 12. I didn't mind. After all, I had gone from being a forgotten old man to the grandfather of a nurse, the father of a humbled son, and the keeper of a family's secret history. One night, as I was preparing for bed, I stood at the window and looked out at the garden. The moonlight spilled gently across the walkway, lighting the bench where I first showed Louise the photograph. I thought of Martha, all those years of silence, all the weight she must have carried, giving up her child, moving forward, building a new life with me. I wish I could have told her it was okay, that her past didn't tarnish her, that her love was always enough, but perhaps she knew. Perhaps, in her own quiet way, she had left the photo for me to find. Perhaps this was her plan all along, not to erase the past, but to give it the chance to bloom again. When the time was right, months passed, I began to walk more. Louise encouraged me to join the art therapy sessions, even though I was more inclined to sketch than paint. I started drawing portraits, residents, staff, and eventually one of Martha, from memory. I gave the drawing to Louise on her birthday. She wept. "I feel like I know her now," she said. And I knew that was all I ever wanted, for the legacy of the woman I loved to live on, not as a ghost, but as a bridge between hearts. One spring morning, Edward returned again, but not alone. He brought his 2 sons, teenagers with messy hair and awkward grins, clearly uncomfortable in the sterile air of a nursing home. But when I told them the story, not the shortened version, but the full, strange, beautiful journey, they listened. They laughed, they asked questions, and by the end of the visit, one of them said, "Grandpa, can we come back next weekend?" I smiled. "Of course, lad, I'm not going anywhere." That evening, as I sat in the garden with Louise, watching the roses bloom again for the first time that season, she asked me, "Do you ever regret anything?" I paused. "Sometimes," I admitted. "I regret not asking your grandmother more about her past. I regret how long I let silence sit in the room between me and your father." She nodded. And now, I looked around, at the wind rustling the leaves, at the faint laughter of other residents echoing down the path, at her face, so familiar, so full of life. "I regret nothing," I said, "because somehow, everything led to this." She squeezed my hand. "Me too," they thought. They were putting me away, out of sight, out of mind. But they didn't realize that even in the quietest corners of the world, life still finds its way back in. Love still grows. And family always finds its way home.